the more likely we are to achieve progress in balancing gender relations. While changes continue to be recorded in the status of women in Africa, African female writers and feminists must be consciously committed to the task of using their creativity in whatever form as a means of maneuvering the misogyny and condescension faced by the average African woman daily. In this regard, the expression of the need for the reappraisal and critical reassessment of African women's texts and context is an integral part of the African feminist movement that should be applauded and maintained. In the textual strategies employed by Adichie and Malope to unravel and challenge patriarchal imbalances in their literary creativity, different feminist thematic concerns in the novel, such as patriarchy and sexist attitudes towards women, the suppression of female sexuality, and violence against women, including sexual violation, domestic violence, son preference syndrome or male child preference syndrome, rape apologism, and the victimization of non-binary sexual women are explored. Both female writers resist sexist attitudes, they challenge patriarchal stereotypes, and they denounce unguarded feminine conformity. I'll just briefly summarize this book, Betrays My Brother. The main crux of the novel is the rape of a friend, of a girlfriend by the main character's brother. And the girl who was raped now becomes the victim of, or she becomes doubly victimized because no one believes her. She's blamed for her own situation. And the funniest thing, or the most interesting thing, is it was women, the female characters in the novel, including the mother of the boy, who kept silent and helped him get away from the arms of the law. You see? So this is the ways in which women also contribute to the perpetuation of sexual violence against women. In Adichie's novel, it's quite a lot, but then she also portrays this insidiousness of patriarchy and women's contribution. So in 1 minute, really?
Yes.
Oh my goodness. Okay, like the woman in the picture, she's chopping wood. This is what women in the villages, like my village, do. They have to chop firewood from really big chunks of wood. And read what I wrote down there. I said the onus is on the African feminist writer and theorist to take up the responsibility through their creativity to rectify and deconstruct such social anomalies that work against the full actualization of women's humanity. We must continue to chop at patriarchy. Everybody carry your axe. Anywhere you are. Now we do like the pastors in Nigeria. Carry your axe, eh? Anywhere you resist. Unlearn, resist, and relearn. Oh, okay. Just give me 1 more minute. This thing there, this happened in Nigeria last week. This is the patriarchy we live in. Patriarchal ageism is one of the things Adichie analyzes also. Please read the first one. For allegedly having sex with a man.
Facebook.
Yes.
Yeah.
Literature and life
are
the same. Literature portrays life, life portrays literature. So, for allegedly having sex with a man on her late husband, not late though, the man has been dead for long.
Yes.
A 70-year-old woman was banished from her community for sleeping. Having sex. The widow was cut. Now, look at this, what we're talking about. The woman is women against women. The woman was caught by her granddaughter. It was her granddaughter who came in and saw her. Having with a 30-year-old, not a 15-year-old, not a 12-year-old. The granddaughter went and reported her to the village elders, who now took her, find her, paraded her throughout the village. Okay, look at the picture. That picture, how many men are behind them, booing at her? It's all women in the crowd. So, no, she's just jealous. She's getting sex. My grandmother is. Oh God.
Cool. Do you mind if we have the lights back on for me? I'm going to struggle to read. Someone?
Wow.
Okay, so my paper is an analysis of a story by Zoe Wicomb called Mrs. Pringle's Bed. And basically the plot is that Mrs. Pringle, who's a so-called coloured woman, living and the story set between about 1919 and 1993, and one day she just decides she's kind of done with this life. I don't know this is the right way to say it, but she basically undresses and gets into her daughter's bed, which has been empty since her daughter left to get married and have a child and everything. And then she basically stays in bed for about 2 or 3 years, and slowly, like, the household changes until she eventually gets up because her husband leaves, which seems to be kind of what she was after, though it doesn't seem to be like that she consciously knows this is what she wants. Okay, so, and I'm kind of trying to do a queer reading of the story. Okay. Zoe Wickham's short story, Mrs. Pringle's Bed, begins on the 14th of May 1990, when Mrs. Pringle takes to her bed, and ends 2 or 3 years later, when Mrs. Pringle finally gets up again. Thus, the story is set in the years between the unbanning of the ANC and South Africa's first democratic elections in 1994. Mrs. Pringle's decision to take to bed seems to be spurred by, as Susan Miriam argues, and I quote, her inarticulate desire to embrace alternative ways of being in the transitional period of the early 90s in South Africa. Her desire might be read as queer, following Ella Kabuma's argument that queerness, and I quote, can find expression as a questing and or questioning that takes its medium as restless, until now nameless bodily desire. Mrs. Pringle's awareness of the ways that things have changed, and that she needs to change with the times, is signalled by her regret at having chosen to marry into the supposed respectability of the Pringle family, which is linked to their settler heritage. By taking to bed, Mrs. Pringle slowly undoes her marriage to the Pringle family, and this action can thus be seen as a kind of revision of her personal history, one in which she makes different choices and rejects aspirations towards whiteness. Mrs. Pringle's transition thus reflects the broader transition of the nationalist discourse of South Africa from one marked by racial division and inequality to the non-racial ideals of the Rainbow Nation. However, by taking to bed, Mrs. Pringle can also be seen to attempt to free herself from the strictures of patriarchal heteronormativity. In order to unpack how Mrs. Pringle goes about this, and in order to consider how this process might be read as queer, Jack Halberstam's discussion of queer time and space is useful. In A Queer Time and Place, Transgender Bodies, Cultural Lives, Halberstam moves away from tying queerness to an essential definition of homosexual embodiment, and considers instead, following Foucault, that it is in its way of life that queerness truly challenges heteronormativity. Queer uses of time and space develop, Halberstam argues, at least in part, in opposition to the institutions of family, heterosexuality, and reproduction. In the South African context, and thus for Mrs. Pringle, these institutions are part and parcel of the broader racialized system. No longer wanting to reproduce the attitudes of the apartheid past, Mrs. Pringle ceases to act and takes to bed, and as a result, ultimately dissolves her marriage. In her rejection of her Pringle inheritance, obtained through heterosexual marriage, Mrs. Pringle rejects what Halberstam calls the timacy that Mrs. Pringle is trying to escape by taking to bed, arguably symbolized by her stripping off her rather conservative clothes, is thus revealed to be deeply ingrained in Mr. Pringle. These traces are not only racist, but misogynist. This is most clearly apparent in the way Mr. Pringle not only uses the derogatory term hot nut, but also refers to Annie's so-called steatopicture, recording the way in which Khoisan women such as Sarah Bartman were used to construct black female sexuality in very dehumanizing ways. However, there's another implication to another possible implication to Mr. Pringle's new fondness for coloured shirts. Brennan Munro points out that the question of gay rights was an element in many narratives in the transitional public culture from which the new South African constitution was forged and with which it engaged, and it thus played an integral yet overlooked role in producing the new imaginary of the rainbow nation, a phrase that encodes the intersection of multiracialism and gay rights. In other words, Mr. Pringle's coloured shirts might be read as implying that Mr. Pringle has embraced the gay identity, a space opened up by the ending of apartheid and the concomitant re-evaluation of the place of the gay person within the nation. Dorothy Driver argues or suggests that there might well be a serious undertone to Mr. Pringle's repudiation of the conventions of a stereotypical South African masculinity, but Wicomb's playful portrayal of this, his girlish wave and his propensity for lilac shirts keeps the tone light. However, even if we assume that these moments imply that Mr. Pringle's late nights at the office are a cover for an affair with another man, this does not make his character queer in the broader sense that Halberstam suggests, that is, as challenging the heteronormative way of life. While Mr. Pringle might be read as gay, his actions are also easily read within a typical heteronormative script. As a character in the story, Cousin Trudy points out, everyone knows that men over 50 go after floozies. He carries on an affair without consideration for his wife's feelings, and even if outside of the domestic space he might be involved in a gay relationship, he seems content with the structure of the household to remain the same. In fact, he is deeply unsettled by his wife's attempt to reorganize it. He also does not challenge the time of inheritance, as is seen by his uninterrupted inheritance of racist and misogynistic attitudes. He also continues to put stock in reproductive time, assuming that his wife will get better as soon as their daughter's baby is born. And by get better, like get out of bed, basically. By never explicitly stating the cause of the changes in Mr. Pringle, Wicomb sidesteps reductive political allegorizing, that Driver argues, by creating an ambiguous space around his sexuality. If we read Mr. Pringle as gay, then it asks us to question, as what Munro suggests, the way that gay identity was cast, at least in some quarters, as an exemplary form that freedom might take. In other words, it reveals the ways in which a gay so-called coloured man might be complicit in perpetuating racist, patriarchal, and heteronormative oppression. So basically, the idea of intersectionality, that simply identifying one way but not questioning other forms of oppression is not necessarily particularly productive. So whether Mr. Pringle is homosexual or heterosexual, his apparent association with the freedoms of the new South Africa is only linked to his freedom to do as he pleases, and ultimately does not translate into real change in terms of social relations or prejudices. In contrast then to the surface level of the change in Mr. Pringle is the change in Mrs. Pringle, and how her taking to bed changes the relationship between her and her maid Annie. In her queer reading of Tsidanga Remba and Yvonne Vera, Boomer defines queer writing not in relation to character representation as such, or to context or theme, but to a particular searching and interrogative approach to relations between women. In the case of Mrs. Pringle's bed, this approach is directed towards the maid-madam relationship. The renegotiation of this relationship is marked by an increased intimacy and dependence between the two women. They share delicious naps, have tea together, and Mrs. Pringle teaches Annie how to knit. When Mrs. Pringle's daughter, concerned about her mother and the new shape of the household, tries to tell Mrs. Pringle that Annie is taking advantage of her, Mrs. Pringle will hear nothing of Annie on whom she has come to rely. When Annie is going to leave for Mokwena because of her abusive husband, Mrs. Pringle is hurt that Annie has not spoken to her about it, stopping her daughter midstream in a tirade about not knowing where her father is on holiday. Mrs. Pringle is, by this point, unfazed by Mr. Pringle's whereabouts. Her primary concern is for Annie. Indeed, her solution is to have Annie move into Mr. Pringle's study, ultimately leading to Mr. Pringle leaving the house. The story can thus be read as depicting a queer shift, as Mrs. Pringle's primary emotional investment shifts from her husband and child to being directed towards another woman who is not her blood kin. This is not to say, however, that Mrs. Pringle is successful in freeing herself from history. Despite the fact that installing Annie in the house might be a queering of the space and the relationship, Mrs. Pringle's dependence on Annie is not without precedence within apartheid South Africa. Judith Latke-Cooley notes that despite the utter separateness of maid and madam in South Africa, it was common for women to experience long-term mutual dependencies. The black maid was, and still is, an indispensable feature of the white woman's life, and the white employer's goodwill was often all that stood between the black domestic worker and destitution. Although both women in Mrs. Pringle's bed are so-called coloured women, the dynamic between them still reflects what Cooley describes. Zanele Mohali also observes the paradoxical nature of the maid-madam relationship, finding it curious that two women could share parts of their personal lives and struggles, despite the years of apartheid that kept one woman in the perpetual role of servant and the other in the lifelong role of madam. In this relationship, gender might be seen to serve as the grounds for solidarity, even as race and its entanglement with class means that the power dynamics between the two women will always be unequal. In other words, the intersection of race, class, and gender can be seen to shape the maid-madam relationship. This kind of paradox is apparent in Mrs. Pringle's bed. Even as the relationship between Annie and Mrs. Pringle changes and grows in intimacy and dependence, and in some ways challenges racialized hierarchies and patriarchal dominance, it is still marked by a problematic history. Mrs. Pringle still retains much of the power in the relationship, as is revealed in the way she orchestrates Annie's move into the study. She instructs Annie that she will be moving in without asking her opinion, to which Annie mutely acquiesces, expecting that she will get used to the idea. In other words, the power dynamic between maid and madam might be altered, but has not been completely revised. Whether the relationship will continue to change after Mrs. Pringle gets out of bed in the final lines of the story is a question that remains unresolved, leading the reader to consider the difficulties of productively reshaping relationships that have been so deeply influenced by an oppressive past, and thus, on a broader scale, the difficulties of truly remaking a nation. This emphasis on change is important to a queer reading of the text. Boomer, drawing from Eve Sedgwick, notes that queer readings are less concerned with how feelings should be than how they change, and, following on from this, how their encodings change. Mrs. Pringle's bed is all about change, and how relationships and spaces might be re-encoded. Mrs. Pringle's desires are not necessarily resolvable into distinct object choices, because they're not specifically about sex. Her desires are linked to broader issues, such as race, class, and gender, even as they play out within the intimacy of the domestic space and the relationship between maid and madam. They're not resolved through a specific alteration in sexuality, but through a redirection of her emotional energy towards a woman. Ultimately, as Miriam notes, having set up an alternative domestic arrangement with Annie, one more convivial and to their mutual satisfaction, Mrs. Pringle escapes from the oppressive yoke of heteronormative domesticity and of a supposedly superior lineage. In this way, Mrs. Pringle can be seen to queer the legacies of colonial and apartheid history and open up a woman-centric space that might be read as full of queer possibilities, even as traces of the past remain.
Makeba goes against Shakespeare's assertion to be or not to be. That is the question. Miriam Makeba, at the height of apartheid, goes against that assertion, and she says that to be is the answer for our liberation in South Africa. So I'm going to start off by playing a bit of this.
Could it be that someday we will finally answer to this jigsaw puzzle that we've been
was a despair without a face bedewed with tears. With it, it carried an unquestionable quality of probity, a kind of despair that bedecks the cruel altars of death with unwavering fortitude. We wondered about your unshakable valiance in the face of the unexpected, and in time we found that your solace was not found in what you had previously hoped for, but it existed in what you already knew. Tragedy bore some unknown veracity about existence, and you happened to uncover it through death. Never would you have considered this as an act of transcendence or a state that others would feel obliged to pay obeisance to, but the situation you were in and your conduct at that particular time provoked such a reception. Sisi Zenzile, how did you do it? How did you do it, Sisi Zenzile? How did you survive the stifling hegemonic structures of the South African apartheid government? Sisi Zenzile, before presenting my humble encomium, I ask, which craft was it that catapulted you to self-realization and self-actualization? Which craft was it that ignited the freedom fighter, the existential feminist in you? Sisi Zenzile, which craft was it that gave you strength when performing with a broken and twisted leg? Which craft was it that made you bathe in the breath of ghosts who suckled the rancid breast milk of history's downtrodden wounds? Which craft was it, Sisi Zenzile, that enabled you to survive several car accidents and a plane crash? Which craft was it? Which craft? Which craft? Existence required one to maintain a pugnacious spirit in the presence of inevitable perils. At every dark interval, there's a tragedy that lurks. There are calamities that force one to take constant mental departures from reality into the ever so familiar territories of fantasy and delusion. The ability to throw oneself recklessly against the inert cliffs of one's thoughts and to come out unscathed is that of a creative brain. To live in one's head provides one with the profound gift of reversible suicide. The advantage of reversible suicide lies in the fact that one could leave the confines of one's present situation momentarily and exist within a different realm. Reversible suicide is much more preferable to that of irreversible suicide. The problem with suicide has always been the fact that one could not disappear through death. Death could never be enough, for it left evidence of one's existence behind. Suicide is only for the benefit of the flibber titubeds. Death was incapable of providing the deceased with the ultimate peripatetic shift into nothingness, where one's existence is obviated from the tenacious memories of others. Living within memories of others is in fact to exist in a different modality. Prince Hamlet, a character in the English poet William Shakespeare's 1603 book titled Hamlet is faced with an existential crisis as he explores the subject or the idea of committing suicide after the death of his father, King Hamlet. One day, Hamlet is visited by the ghost of his late father, informing him that he had been murdered by Hamlet's uncle, Claudius. By this time, Claudius has already gone and married Hamlet's mother, Queen Gertrude. Prince Hamlet is distraught and he grows ever so depressed. The book Hamlet follows Prince Hamlet as he plots to avenge the death of his father. This Shakespearean tragedy is notable for its well-known quote, "To be or not to be, that is the question." This serves as the opening phrase of one of Prince Hamlet's soliloquies. Prince Hamlet is suicidal and questions whether it is a good idea to go on living considering the events that had occurred with regards to his father's passing. The story of Hamlet bears similarities to the life of the South African singer and political and human rights activist Sisi Zenzile Miriam Makeba. Miriam Makeba was born in Johannesburg on the 4th of March and died on the 9th of November in Italy in the year 2003. She was a political exile, meaning that she was banned from South Africa because of her political activism. Sisi Zenzile Miriam Makeba was known for her advocacy against the apartheid government and for her commitment towards fighting sexism. Miriam Makeba's mother, Christina Makeba, was a Swazi traditional healer, a Sangoma. She worked also as a domestic worker. Makeba's father was Xhosa and worked as a teacher and died when Makeba was very young. In 1960, after the massacre in Sharpeville, that Miriam Makeba's mother died while Makeba was outside of South Africa. Upon learning about her mother's death, Makeba tried to come back to South Africa to attend the funeral, only to find that her South African passport had been revoked. Like Prince Hamlet, Makeba grew depressed and became suicidal. According to the European existentialist Camus, I see many people die because they judge that life is not worth living. I see others paradoxically getting killed for the ideas or illusions that give them a reason for living. What is called a reason for living is also an excellent reason for dying. Unquote. One can draw from this contention made by Camus the similarities between South African and European existentialism. This contention made by Camus is reminiscent of the statement made by South African freedom fighter and leader of the Black Consciousness Movement, Steve Biko. Quote Biko, "I'd rather die for an idea that will live than live for an idea that will die." Both Camus and Biko's position on suicide and the power of ideas complement that of Miriam Makeba's take on the power of being. Sequentially, they evidence Makeba's work as that pertaining to a South African existential feminism. Makeba's suicidal contemplations only led her to discover her life's purpose as a conduit, as a mediator between the physical and the spiritual world. Her ancestral worship and ability to heal did not manifest itself through osmomancy, but it evidenced itself on stage through her emotive performances. The Sangoma is not phasmophobic, but she, or he, represents the worlds of ghosts and spirits. But she respects the worlds of ghosts and spirits to know that there are certain algorithms that need to be employed when the dead speak through the living, and when the Sangoma's body is used to mediate this process. Like Prince Hamlet, Makeba was often haunted by the ghost of her late mother, the Swati Sangoma, traditional healer. And it was after her mother's death that Makeba started engaging in open conversations with the ghost of her mother. The failure to come back home to attend her mother's funeral was not only tragic, but it marked the beginning of Makeba's involvement in protest performances that were accompanied by politically charged songs. It was at this time that Makeba wrote the song "We Got to Make It." It was at this time that Makeba became a Sangoma, Sangoma, Yezingoma, the witch doctor of songs. Like Shakespeare's Prince Hamlet, Makeba sought to avenge her mother's death by fighting against the apartheid government. It is evident that the code to be or not to be, that is the question, is one of the most recognizable codes in English literature. Makeba then uses this infamous code to disrupt or to destabilize the structure of European pedagogy by disagreeing, while in the same instance fashioning our own historical mission through the denial of a former construct. To quote the French existentialist and the romantic partner of French existential feminist Simone de Beauvoir, Jean-Paul Sartre, and the Afro-Caribbean psychiatrist Frantz Fanon's book, The Rapture of the Earth, Sartre contends, we only become who we are by the radical and deep-seated refusal of that which others have made of us. Unquote. The refusal to model oneself against a past or belittling ideology is the start of discovering one's being and what one's being is not. Sartrean existentialism is founded upon the principles of skepticism and self-examination. Sartre consistently maintains that existence precedes essence, that who you are is a function of what you do. According to Biko, black culture, above all, implies freedom on our part to innovate without recourse to white values. This innovation is part of the natural development of any culture. A culture is essentially a society's composite answer to the varied problems of life. To be an existentialist is to be a philologist. It is to be responsible for one's own existence. Makeba shares a similar idea as that of Sartre's model of denial or becoming through others. Makeba states, nobody will know the pain of exile until you are in exile. No matter where you go, there are times when people show you kindness and love, and there are times when they make you know what you are, that you are. Sorry, let me go back on the statement. No matter where you are, nobody will know the pain of exile until you are in exile. No matter where you go, there are times when people show you kindness and love, and there are times when they make you know that you are with them, but not with them. Since being is not a singular entity, one's being is often associated to time, place, and space. And to be in time, place, and in space is to exist in a world of otherness. It is to exist while negotiating identity in accordance to these aspects. One's task is always to examine certain aspects of an individual's identity, unpack them, discover them, mark some as true and others as false. The death of the other aspects that make up being result in the life of others. Miriam Makeba's negation of the question of being and her carefully considered positioning of being as the ultimate answer to be, becomes the answer to our human, moral, feminist, and political situation. It becomes a magical act expressed through a newly found culture of performance and song. I shall close this presentation with a quote by the American Black existentialist Dr. Lewis Gordon. The blues, which are the foundations for jazz and most 20th century popular music, are premised on an insight in stream with Nietzsche's discussion of an ancient Greek tragedy and the birth of tragedy from the spirit of music. Nietzsche argued that tragedies took on the suffering of life in its genuine terror and absurdity. In doing so, it enabled an adult affirmation of life through facing reality as void. The blues offers suffering with ironic twists and turns that point to adult responsibility. There is wisdom, for instance, in understanding that life is not fair, that there are not material values waiting out there to support us in a nest in which we could remain permanently children. Growing up is a painful ideal. It is a form of productive loss. Our attachments are often the source of misery, and much liberation is gained in discovering how much there is in life of which we must let go. We need to learn. The blues tell us to laugh so we can cope, but also to cry that we can see more clearly and become actional. Sartre's love for jazz, a product of blues music, was connected to his commitment to enjoy life while not denying its trials. Thank you.
Thank you, Palesa. And now we open up the floor for questions. The next one. Yes, Joy.
Thank you very much for the beautiful presentation. I have a comment before I ask my question. I just want to say that it is time. I said it yesterday, and I want to repeat it again. It is time for us as women to stop fighting against ourselves. It is time for us as women to stop oppressing ourselves. I said it that it is time for us, you don't fight against your team partner, regardless of race, regardless of tribe, no matter where you're coming from. So it's time for us to team up as women, try to tolerate. You have a fault. So when you see another fault in another woman, remember that you are not without fault, so that we can work together as a team. And then when you see oppression, we need to start working from now, from our closet. What do we do to stop some practices? Here at Rhodes, I was in a place with about 3 scholars. Then there was one that was elderly. She was accusing the other younger scholar that you touched my laptop, you did this, you are a liar, you are a thief. I don't know whether you understand what I'm saying. And I was there, I was watching the scene. Now I know the origin of, one is a South African, one is the West African. So I saw what happened in So Long a Letter. For those of us who have read So Long, Senegalese, how they oppress, how fellow women oppress other women. I said, even at Rhodes, you want to bring up this kind of, and that was what I was saying. So I was watching the scene of the elderly woman really oppressing the younger scholar. You are a thief, you are a this. Even when she used, okay, let's assume she actually used, is that enough for you to, you could see that oppression? I just said, Mama, nobody's a thief here, okay? This is, that's what I mean. We start from our closet. These things must stop. Thank you very much for that presentation. Now, I want to ask this question. I saw that video of how that woman spoke. As women, what do we do to stop, the one that was saying men are this, men should be pampered, men should be boys, and what she said, every other person, every other younger woman, the thing becomes, so how do we start to curb such things that women are doing against fellow women? That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll take one from Betty.
Thank you for your presentation. I just wondered, as a tangential question, how relocation has made more strident. Edici relocating, and Wicomb as well. And in some ways, Miriam Makeba being in exile, how they then had a more strident perspective on Africa and on the politics of protest and of struggle, and claiming spaces, the Wicomb paper, claiming spaces more heroically.
There's something in that video as well, I want to comment on that. Because she started off by saying, what do you call a woman, a man who beats up a woman, then it's abuse. And what do you call a woman who beats up a man? And I thought she was going somewhere.
Yes.
I thought she was going somewhere, honestly, when she said that, or maybe she was going to provide us with an answer. And I feel like it's a question that you didn't engage with to some extent, in terms of what do you call a woman who beats up a man? In a sense that if we can't deny that we're birthing boy children as well in this present stage that we're in, and we're feminists, and we're all these other things that we are, patriarchy that you mentioned, and everything else, So you don't choose as well what you give birth to. So I'm just wondering, to have a boy child that you birth, and then you raise them in the way that you want to raise them, but to have a female raised in another manner of other patriarchy, if you put it in a sense, and then having a bit a man, what do you call that, right? And then the second one, I was just not, I'd like for you to expand more on the past, present, and future in queerness. I was interested in that. And also, there was a description you gave of a white t-shirt and then you changed to wearing color t-shirt, and then you said it plays into race in a way. I would like you to clear that for me as well. And then Palesa, I'm interested in this idea of witchcraft, and the repetition that you did there. And then you went into witchcraft. What is your definition of witchcraft, Isangoma, and the traditional healer in that sense? And also, Miriam Makeba, you know, within this Isangoma as a traditional healer and a witchcraft, and defining it, to some extent, there's language there. And I feel like you didn't interact with how she uses language and also text that exists on this idea of a witchcraft and Isangoma within the Xhosa space or within the Swaziland, the mother. So, yeah, Swaziland. There's relationships there in terms of the training as well, you know. Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Should we just have a round of answers? We will take more questions later. Okay, Susan, do you want to?
Okay, I don't even know how to start. My mouth is full. But I'm just going to try and merge the two questions. It's about how the dual nature of patriarchy, right? That's what you're saying. She said, she began with, when a man abuses a woman, it's called domestic violence. Then she also asked, when a woman abuses a man, what is it called? It's domestic violence. Violence is violence, regardless of who is perpetrating it or who is being the recipient of the violence. Violence is violence and should be criticized on every level. But what I don't like is the deviation from the subject of women's violence. Women violate men. Women violate women. Men violate men. Men violate women. But the most insidious form of violence is gendered violence. Violence of men against women. And it's so painful. Once you want to talk about gendered violence, people want to bring up what of men? No, we know men are also abused. How many women beat their men? Maybe 1 in 50. But every day, you go on social media, you see pictures of women battered up, even on the streets, on campuses. I experienced one on my campus. This guy wanted to strangle this girl in the car. She opened the door and jumped out of the moving vehicle. I called her, drew her, held her. This guy reversed to the car, came to where we were both standing, and I was trying to console her. He came, demonstrating this aggressiveness, speaking, follow me now. Zandra, he was speaking in Afrikaans, follow me now. And I told her, don't go with this guy. I was holding her. Do you know what this girl did? She said, no, don't worry, I made him angry. I was the one that caused it. Do you know she went with this guy in the car? The only thing I could do was to go and report to the security. I lodged a case of assault, witnessing an assault. That was all I could do. And the next day, I got her name from her reg number from the security. I went to her Facebook page. I stalk people on Facebook a lot. And I'm going to start stalking. I already started with you. I went to her Facebook page. Guess what? She was posting pictures, loved up pictures. After that incident of escaping death, she jumped out of a moving vehicle. She would have been hurt somehow. The next day, I mean the following morning, they were loving up by the swimming pool, and she was posting the pictures on. So it's, yes, men violence, women violence, but the issue here, worldwide, especially in Africa, is violence against women. And that is what we should tackle for now. But then also, we should also discuss both. Because patriarchy is a what do you call this ball? Ping pong ball. It bounces up, it affects even the patriarch as much as it affects the oppressed. Negative masculinity affects men as much as it affects women. To change these things, we have to start with resocialization. Ideals of gender are constructed. Nobody is born knowing they're male or female, or knowing what women should do and what men should do. It's through socialization that gender is imbibed and instilled into human behavior. And to change things, we also have to go through socialization, resocialization, unlearn. The American futurist Alvin Toffler said that the illiterate of the 21st century would not be those who cannot read and write, but those who are unable to learn, unlearn, and relearn. So everything we have learned, I, sitting here, I used to be a patriarchal princess. I'm telling you. Because I grew up in patriarchy.
Yeah.
I come from Nigeria. It's like, if you know Nigeria now, you know. Watch home videos if you don't know. Follow a few of them on Facebook and see. Because that's just the best way to understand what it means to be female in Nigeria. And to top it up, I come from the Igbo culture. So this is the bedrock of when you talk of patriarchy. Women are second-class citizens. Bucheme Teta wrote about this years ago,
1974.
in 1974. It's still the same. I did show you a picture here of a woman being disgraced and banished just because she slept. She had sex.
70 years.
70-year-old woman. What has age got to do with? But now look at this woman now, she's triply oppressed. One, she's a widow. The Igbo culture has stringent cultures and traditions that oppress widows. When you lose your husband, you're dealing with the pain of losing a loved one. And then you have to face these cultures and traditions, in-laws, who want to accuse you of being responsible for the man's death. It's just recently that some of these cultures have begun to be abolished. Still, some people still practice them. And guess what? It is women.
That perpetrate it.
Yes, who perpetrate it. It is the women who go in to say, your husband died just last month and you're already wearing Ankara. Go and wear your black and white. Or we'll go and report you to the women's meeting. I don't know if you understand what I'm saying.
Yes.
They want her to stay indoors just because she lost her husband. But this same culture does not apply to the man. When a man loses his wife, the wakekeep is tonight. By tomorrow night, he's in a guest house with a girlfriend trying to console him.
By 3 months, he's married.
By 3 months, he's remarried.
Yes. Yes.
But the woman is confined. You just lost your husband. You have to scrape your hair. It is the women that will go and get razor blade and sit you down and scrape your hair. It's not the men. It is the women. So we have to start tackling these things. In writing, we as feminists, while I was still in Nigeria, I was among those that used to say, I'm getting old, oh, I need to get married. Because this is what you hear.
Yeah.
You cannot even go to the village now. This auntie, you people came back from the town. And when did you come? Hey, Ada, you're big now. When are you getting married? Oh my goodness. I'm like, you're not even asking me how is school. Have I gotten a job? I've been unemployed for 3 years. Auntie, ask me when I'm getting a job now. If you know someone, if you have any contacts, get me a job. Stop asking me. They will, and then you get married. 2 weeks. And you're not pregnant. This is your tummy. Are you sure you're sleeping with your husband well? If you don't know the styles, come, let me show you. If you don't get this pregnancy now, he's going to marry a second wife, or he will look outside. And then you get pregnant. You have 1 child.
A girl.
If it's a girl, you're on your own. That is on your own. If it's a boy, okay, yeah, 1, but we need another 1. Before 6 months, this baby is old enough to have a sibling. They'll start disturbing you. So the problem goes on and on and on. It is never ending. But then it is still gender, how do you call it, socialization. But it's more painful to see younger women replicating these ideas. And this is why as feminists, we just need to keep talking. You know, a woman is battered by her husband. She leaves the marriage. Some woman will come, if she posts the picture on Facebook, please, I need help. Any legal assistance, help me. This man has been battering me. Someone will come there and say,
be submissive to your husband.
Be submissive to your husband. You're the cause of your problem. Nobody asks why should the man even hit the woman in the first instance? You were not submissive enough. They'll blame you. You were not submissive enough.
You talked back at him.
Yes. Why did you raise your voice when he was talking? When his voice goes high, your voice should come
low. There's thunder and there's lightning.
It's terrible.
Yeah,
it's terrible. You know?
Thank you, Susan.
Yeah, it is.
I told you my mouth is full.
Thank you so much. I think we'll hand over to Jenny, who has 10 minutes, and then also Palesa will have the last say. Okay, Jenny.
Okay, I'm going to start with, I think, the last question, because I'm not sure to answer the first one. So on the issue of coloured shirts and race, just like on a textual level, the idea of white, like the white colour and the link to the idea of race. And so I was just reading that almost on a symbolic level, the potential there for this sort of symbolism of change, a movement away from this aspiration towards whiteness, towards perhaps a more progressive attitude towards race and racial identity. And I suppose that then links to this idea of like the rainbow nation, like this multicolored nation, that symbolism again. So, and I suppose that links to some ideas that I think Wicomb's kind of playing with about this movement in South Africa in '94, and that transition period from kind of white supremacy to the supposed rainbow nation, which is supposed to be multiracial or non-racial, whereas the way that in some ways only took place on a symbolic level, or in the realm of discourse or ideology. No, in the realm of discourse, but didn't actually change much necessarily on the ground. So I suppose that's where I was trying to go with that. I don't know if that answers your question. Does it? Okay. On the issue of past, present, and future, and the idea of queerness, I was kind of drawing from Halberstam there, who kind of argues that queer people, because they're sort of living out of this idea that time and the ideas of past, present, and future, and sort of linear time are very much linked to heteronormativity. So this idea of reproduction, so the heteronormative family, it's meant to produce children, and thus there's this very clear line of, you grow up, you get married, you have children, you grow old, and you die, kind of thing. Whereas she was arguing that queer people, because they don't, especially before, I suppose, there was legislation that allowed for gay marriage and adoption, there was a different, she argues that queer people had a different relationship to time, also with the AIDS crisis and stuff. So yeah, she's kind of playing on that idea. So this idea that the idea of queer time, it might offer us a different relationship to time. So moving away from that kind of reproductive or linear kind of mode of time, is like you pass this on. The questions of what if there's no one, you don't have blood kin to pass something on to, or your life is probably not going to go in that heteronormative kind of lineage, and what kind of alternative ways of looking at time does it offer us? Again, I don't know if that answers your question.
No, I wanted to hear from you.
Okay, okay, cool. And then on the issue of location and relocation and how that's kind of changed.
And sharpens their critique.
Yeah, it's something I've been wondering about, this kind of relationship between African women writing from the diaspora, and I'm not sure if I have an answer. I mean, I read somewhere that about African women writing about queer issues, that it kind of, because they're removed from that space where it's taboo to talk about, they have like a freedom to write about it. And I don't know if I completely agree necessarily. I'm not sure how to conceptualize that really. I think also somehow some people only can write because they're from the diaspora. If you, in other countries where you don't have like a publishing industry or something like that. So
the way the problems become pressing,
yeah.
and the response is unequivocal, Adichie.
Yeah.
So, you know, how is she speaking to African women, to us on the continent?
Yes.
It's unequivocal
Yeah, I see what you mean.
because of the perspective.
Yeah. I kind of feel Wicomb is always equivocal though. I'm not
Yes.
sure if,
Yes.
like that's what I find with her work. You like think she's saying one thing and then you're like, wait, maybe she
But
always
that also
problematizes
has
on a level.
A
Yeah,
sharpness and a perspective.
that's also true.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Can I just chip in something to what she said? I think when you're in imprisonment, when you have not tasted what freedom is like, it's difficult to define freedom. It was Harriet Tubman, the American feminist, black American feminist, who said that I would have freed 1,000 slaves if they had known that they were enslaved. So moving out of that contested side of oppression gives women in the diaspora a new perspective to self-agency. And this is reflected in their writing. If Adichie was still in Nigeria, she would not have that autonomy to write fiercely and speak fiercely against patriarchy as much as she does in the United States. Because she's in a place where there is a kind of liberal open-mindedness, she's able to voice. I don't know if I'm answering your question. She's now able to articulate objectively those feelings that have been, withheld or suppressed within.
Right. Palesa? That's your turn.
Thank you, Felisa, for the question. The witchcraft sentences, I did it deliberately because I was interested in the fact that there has always been existentialism in South Africa, but there isn't much written about existentialism in South Africa. And French existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre once said that jazz is the music of the future, and he regarded jazz as a type of existential music. And he said that he used to hang out with Miles Davis, and he met Charlie Parker, and yeah, he used to listen to Coltrane. So because I was a huge jazz fan and I loved the existential novels, I started questioning, well, in South Africa, do we have examples of existential feminists who were also jazz musicians? So as I listened to Miriam Makeba and this particular song, We Got to Make It, I found that the statement that she made were very existential. And I was interested in the fact that Miles Davis, I think he identified himself as a magician, and most of his recordings are about spirits and ghosts, as much as he was a freedom fighter, maybe. He loved making recordings about those particular subjects. So I just found it very strange that Miles Davis, as a character or as an existential musician, was associated with everything that is magical, while we had our own Miriam Makeba, whose mother was in fact a traditional healer. And I mean, Miriam Makeba's life is very strange, that how could you survive even seven car accidents, a plane crash? I mean, the things that Miriam Makeba went through, and her always commenting that I'm here because of the conversations I used to have with my mother. I'm here because of, I mean, in a sense, it's almost as if the apartheid government didn't win because her mother was always talking to her. And I found that to be really clever, because Sartre's book, Being and Nothingness, is premised on that. Being is the same as nothingness. Talking to you is the same as not talking to you. So it's always a constant contradiction. I loved existentialism because of that. It answers questions without answering questions. Even Sartre himself, he wrote so much on existentialism, but he didn't give the definition of existentialism. So he didn't define it, but he wrote on it because he found that we as humans, we like the idea of completion. What happens when we die? What happens when this and that happens? And he sort of said that we should embrace the idea of incompletion. So I was looking at that, you know, it's fine that we have these incredible jazz musicians like Miriam Makeba, who's more, I think, more incredible than Miles Davis, who's more of a magician, but I don't know, not much has been written about that. I don't know if that answers.
Right, one last question, Nalika.
I was thinking, you know, it's such a beautiful thing to weave together existentialism with performance of Miriam Makeba and her as a singer and her creative force, right? And last night, I don't know if you were at the panel, Charlene's big question to the panel, the last panel that was on, was how is creative practice a site of theorization, right? And that one of the things that became a repeated motif was that creative practice is theorization, and that even without relying that much on Sartre as the source for your paper. You can look at Makeba herself as the source of existential, her longing, and her music as the site in which she explores that.
Yes.
Because that's not to dismiss, like to just be like, we don't need the Europeans or whatever, but that we do have, as you said, indigenous existentialists.
Yes.
Are the lives we've led and the conditions, the political conditions, the social conditions we've lived have been sites that create those kinds of angst and dissociation, more than Sartre would ever experience in the safety of Paris. With Simone de Beauvoir, I just want to add this, in a very problematic relationship, if you know more about, the very problematic gender roles that they play. So I'm not saying don't quote that person, but to say you don't even need to rely that much. You can even say things like, we know the Europeans as the so-called source of, but what if we start thinking about theorizing existentialism from the global south, from South Africa? Who are our philosophers? And then let's introduce our performance artists as the source, right? How beautiful, if I could work with you on your paper, this is what I would tell you, because it's such a brilliant idea.
And can I just build on that? Because as in your conclusion, you conclude with Lewis Gordon's thinking around the blues. I mean, the other person whom I've relied on thinking about the connection between the blues and how sort of black people think about democracy is, of course, what Cornel West has done with Toni Morrison's work and his ideas about tragicomic hope, because he argues that in a sense, Morrison does what jazz does, but in fiction, right? Because the word, what she does with language, I mean, it jumps off the page. I mean, she calls it the blues woman of the highest order, and so as you were talking, I was wondering, why is Makeba not put in the room of the people that she was with, like Nina Simone, her peers, her real peers in a sense, and that long tradition of what black people have done with blues music, with jazz, as a true democratic form, in a sense, that allows us to trace, as Morrison does, as Makeba does, not only to trace history, but to even transcend into the spiritual. There's a Nigerian man, I'm forgetting his name, I mean, his thing, who loved Makeba, used to make the argument that, people like Makeba, and of course, Tandiswa, who follow Makeba, there's a moment in which one doesn't make the distinction between the physical and the spiritual. And that's a purely black tradition. And to start from Paris, I'm not so sure, that should be the starting point.
Right, we will have Betty. We literally have 5 minutes. So we'll have Betty, a short
wanted to
comment.
say that the last comments are powerful because it's in the spirit of decolonizing our way of thinking, and it's powerful. We do not have to validate the thinking and our discourses by recourse to necessarily, doesn't mean we don't, to Western sources. It's implicit in the work.
Thank you, Betty. Okay, you get like a minute.
Even the second that you used when you were speaking, actually, I was struck by a sense of possession also. So there's also, I think along with all of this, that as you spoke, and as you, the ghost that you were speaking with, I think was complete. I mean, it was was part of the intensity of the performance. So actually, it's for me, the angst was already layered into the word I kept thinking was a sense of a possession as you spoke. So I think it was concurrent with also the languaging of the anxiety within the presentation. So I thought that was quite powerful.
Thank you so much for all the comments. So, under my study is called Cosmo-existential feminism. So this will be the new South African existential feminism. So it is a decolonial project. So I'm busy working on another project with Dr. Khan, but it's based on visual arts. But in the future, my studies are going to be based on South African jazz. So thank you so much for the question.
Right. So the T, is it here? Okay, so let's just give you guys a round of applause.